I remember the first time I saw him. It was in the town square, under a sun that didn't seem to care about the people sweating beneath it. He was inside a cage, one of those old, iron cages that looked like they'd been pulled straight from the dark stories my grandfather told me about. The bars were thick, rusted in places, and the floor was nothing but bare wood. There was a strange smell, a mix of sweat, dust, and something I couldn't quite name, but it made my stomach twist. People gathered around, whispering to each other, laughing, and sometimes just staring with mouths open like they were seeing a creature from another world. And maybe, in some ways, he was. He didn't look like the men who walked the streets freely. He was thin, almost painfully so, but not frail. There was a kind of quiet strength in him, the kind that comes from knowing life is a harsh teacher. His hair was dark and tangled, and his eyes, well, they were the kind that saw too much, like he had stared into the truth of things most people preferred to ignore. I couldn't tell if he was sad, angry, or just tired of the world. Probably all of them. No one knew where he came from. Some said he had been caught wandering the forests outside the town, living among wild animals and talking to shadows. Others claimed he was the son of a noble who had lost everything in a gamble, cursed to live in a cage as punishment for crimes that weren't entirely his own. My friends told me stories I shouldn't have believed, about how he could read minds or speak to birds and trees. I wasn't sure if I believed them either, but when I looked at him, I wanted to. I wanted to think that someone so strange, so apart from the world, could hold secrets I would never know. At first, I just watched from afar. I was too small, too scared to get close, and my parents had told me to stay away from trouble. But curiosity is a funny thing, it doesn't care about warnings or reason. One afternoon, when the sun was low and the square was quieter, I edged closer. He looked at me then, not with fear or anger, just with recognition. Like he had been waiting for someone like me to come along. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just leaned against the bars and watched the shadows stretch across the ground. I thought maybe he didn't hear me, but then he spoke, and his voice was soft, almost musical, but there was something heavy underneath it, something that made my chest ache. "They put me here," he said. "Because they fear what they cannot understand. Because I am different, and the world does not like different." I didn't know what to say. Everyone around him had already decided who he was: a freak, a criminal, a curiosity to entertain themselves with. But hearing him speak like that, calmly and without begging, made me feel a strange sense of guilt. I don't understand," I stammered. "That's the thing," he said, tilting his head. "Most people never do. They look, they laugh, they point, and they move on. Few have the patience to look closely enough to see the truth." I wanted to see. I wanted to know the truth of him, of what made him so unlike anyone else. So I kept coming back, day after day, until people started noticing. Some of the older townsfolk frowned and shook their heads when they saw me talking to him. Others whispered things, warning me that he was dangerous, or cursed, or unclean. But I didn't care. I wanted to learn, to understand. He started telling me stories. At first, they were small tales of the forests at night, of rivers that whispered secrets, of creatures that watched humans without being seen. Then they grew bigger, stories about people he had known, places he had been, and things he had seen. Some of the stories were magical, or so they seemed to me, and some were terrifying, like glimpses into lives I would never have. But through all of them, there was a sadness that never went away. He spoke of loss, of betrayal, and of loneliness that was too heavy to shake. I learned that he had not always been in the cage. Once, he had a life beyond bars, a life full of freedom and the wide, endless sky. But the world had changed, and the people around him had grown cruel. They could not accept him for who he was, so they trapped him. And yet, even trapped, he did not seem broken. His spirit, I realized slowly, was not something iron bars could contain. Sometimes, he would ask me to do things for him. Simple things: bring him water, a piece of bread, or just sit nearby and listen. And I did, because I wanted him to know that someone saw him, really saw him. He once told me, with a smile that was almost frightening in its sadness, that being seen was the rarest gift in the world. And I think that's why I kept returning. I wanted to give him that gift. But the cage was a constant reminder that the world was not kind. I saw how people would stare, laugh, and sometimes throw scraps of food or stones. They treated him like an object, a thing to observe, not a man to know. And every time I saw that cruelty, I felt a fire inside me, a mixture of anger and helplessness. I wanted to free him, to tear down the bars with my bare hands, but I was just a boy, and he often told me that patience and knowledge were stronger than brute force. He began teaching me things I didn't expect. Not lessons from books or from school, but lessons about life, about seeing the world clearly, about understanding people and their fears. He spoke of courage, of truth, of the dangers of following the crowd without thinking. I listened, wide-eyed, and sometimes I wrote down what he said in secret notebooks, hiding them under my bed. One day, he told me about hope. Not the kind of hope that whispers lies to comfort us, but a real hope, the kind that grows even when the world seems to have forgotten you. He said that hope was dangerous, yes, because it made you long for freedom, but it was also the only thing that could make life bearable. And so, day by day, I learned from him. I learned about patience, about courage, about the human heart. And I also learned that some people, no matter how much they are hated or misunderstood, have a strength that cannot be measured in muscles or swords. The cage was iron and wood, but it could not hold his mind, nor the stories he carried, nor the fire in his heart. And I began to understand that history, the true kind, is not only in books or battles, but in the lives of people who are forced to endure what others cannot imagine. I didn't know then how his story would end, or if I would have the courage to see it through. But I knew that, somehow, I had found a teacher, a friend, and a living reminder that the world is bigger and stranger than anyone can imagine. And I wanted, more than anything, to carry his story forward, to remember it, to tell it, so that someday, someone else might understand what it truly means to live, even in a cage. Days turned into weeks, and I kept visiting him. The town had grown accustomed to his presence, or maybe they just ignored him now, but I never grew used to the sight of him confined behind those bars. There was something about watching a man live a life reduced to the size of a cage that made the world feel smaller, crueler, and at the same time, more complicated than I had ever imagined. One afternoon, I brought a small book I had found in my father's library. It was filled with tales of distant lands, of people who had faced impossible odds, and I thought maybe he would like it. I handed it through the bars, and he took it gently, like it was a fragile bird. He opened it, his fingers brushing the pages with a care that made me realize he had once held other treasures in his life, things no cage could ever steal. "This is yours," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing the gift, and then smiled faintly. "Not mine," he said. It is now a companion. It will remind me that even in a cage, stories can travel further than legs or wings ever could. I realized then that he had a way of seeing the world that I could barely understand. While everyone else in the town saw only a man trapped, he saw possibilities, connections, and meanings hidden beneath the surface. He had a kind of wisdom that came not from comfort or wealth, but from suffering and observation, and it made me want to be better, to think more deeply about the people and the world around me. He began speaking more about his past, though not everything. Some stories were like old scars, too painful to show in full. He told me about a village he had lived in as a boy, where he had known laughter and music and the smell of bread baking in the morning. He spoke of friends who had vanished, either swallowed by time or taken by cruel circumstances. And sometimes, when his voice softened, he spoke of a family he had lost, a life that could have been, a freedom that had been stolen. What did they want from you? I asked one evening, my curiosity braver than my fear. Control, he said simply. People fear what they cannot govern. They cannot understand a mind that does not follow their rules, so they lock it away. Sometimes with chains, sometimes with laws, sometimes with fear. They do not want you to live freely, they want you to fit. And if you cannot fit, they punish you. I shivered. I had seen it happen in small ways in my own town, people punished for speaking too loudly, for asking questions, for simply being different, but I had never thought about it on this scale. Here was a man, a full-grown man, confined not because he had done harm, but because the world found him strange. And yet, despite it all, he remained unbroken. That was the part that scared me, and awed me, all at once. One night, I decided to stay longer than usual. My parents had gone to a gathering, and I slipped out with a lantern and a loaf of bread. The streets were quiet, the moon casting long, silver shadows that danced across the walls. When I reached the cage, I found him not sleeping, but sitting quietly with his eyes closed, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. I brought this, I whispered, placing the bread near him. He opened his eyes and studied me. You are brave, he said, not as praise, but as an observation. Most children would not come alone, and most adults would not care enough to bring bread. We ate in silence for a while, sharing the meager food between the bars. And then, as the night deepened, he spoke of something I had never considered, the idea of time inside a cage. To live in one of these, he said, gesturing to the iron bars around him, is to measure life differently. Days blend, nights stretch endlessly, and yet every moment is sharper than any outside. Pain is clearer. Loneliness is deeper. And yet, hope can still burn, even here. You just have to tend it, as carefully as you tend a fire in the cold. I had never thought of it that way. I had imagined a cage as something that merely confined the body, but he showed me that the mind, the heart, the very soul could feel the weight far heavier than iron. And yet, his mind was not confined. His stories, his laughter, his thoughts, they traveled further than any of the townsfolk could imagine. Over the next few weeks, he began teaching me practical things too. How to read the clouds to predict rain, how to find fresh water in the driest places, how to move quietly through the woods without disturbing the birds. He said that these skills were not just for survival, but for understanding the world. A person who knows how to listen, he explained, can hear the truth in things that are not spoken. And the world is mostly silent, if you know how to listen. I listened, and I tried to learn. I realized that he was not just teaching me facts or survival skills, he was teaching me to see, to think, to question. And in some ways, he was teaching me how to live in a world that could be cruel and unfair, without letting it destroy me. One evening, as I left, I noticed a man from the town approaching the cage. He was tall and broad, with a face that carried the weight of authority, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. The man looked at the cage, then at me, and frowned. "You've been spending too much time here, boy," he said. "Stay away. You don't want to get mixed up in things beyond your understanding." I wanted to argue, to defend the man in the cage, but I didn't. I just nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and anger. It wasn't just that they wanted to control him, they wanted to control me too, to make sure that no one saw the truth, that no one learned, that no one cared. When I returned the next day, the man in the cage noticed the tension in me. "The world fears knowledge," he said quietly. "It fears the simple truth, that people are not always what they seem, and that freedom is dangerous to those who cannot have it." I didn't know if I was ready to understand that fully, but I wanted to. I wanted to understand everything he had to teach me, to carry it with me, to see the world as he saw it. And I realized that the cage, terrible as it was, had not made him smaller. It had not taken his mind, his stories, his spirit. I began to notice small changes in the townsfolk too. Some of the younger children watched him quietly, without laughing or pointing. A few adults slowed their pace when they walked by, looking at him with a glance that seemed to carry a hint of respect, or perhaps guilt. It was subtle, but I knew it mattered. Even in chains, his presence could make people think. And that, he said once, was a kind of power that could never be taken away. As I walked home that evening, I realized that I was learning more than I had ever imagined from a man in a cage. Not just about the forests or the skies or survival, but about life and courage and the ways the world could be unfair and yet still hold beauty. And I understood, even then, that his story was more than his own. It was a lesson for everyone who would listen, and I had the chance, the responsibility, to carry it forward. By the time autumn came, the air had grown sharp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and smoke from the chimneys. I noticed that the man in the cage had grown quieter. Not sadder, exactly, but more deliberate in his speech, as if he were conserving something: strength, energy, or perhaps memory. I tried to speak to him as usual, but he would pause mid-conversation, looking past me, beyond the bars, as though seeing something invisible. "Do you ever get lonely?" I asked one afternoon, brushing a bit of dust from the cage bars before sitting down. The square was nearly empty, save for a few lingering merchants packing their wares. He smiled faintly, a shadow of something I couldn't name. "Lonely," he repeated. "I have been lonely in many ways. But this is different. Loneliness here is measured in hours and minutes. Outside, it is measured in moments. Here, the world presses close, even when it is absent. The bars remind me constantly that people fear me, that the world does not welcome me." I swallowed hard. I had always imagined the loneliness of a cage as physical, something you could see in the rusted iron or the hard wooden floor. But he made it sound alive. A thing that could creep into your bones, whisper in your mind, and make each second heavier than the last. "I don't understand," I said. "You will," he said softly, with the patience of someone who had waited for years. "The world is not made for those who are different. And difference," he said, tapping the side of his head, "is not only in your body, but in your mind, your thoughts, your dreams. People fear what cannot be tamed, and I have been untamable." I thought about what he said while walking home. untamable. It sounded frightening, but also powerful. I realized that the cage had not truly confined him, because the essence of a person cannot be caged. You can take their freedom, you can take their home, even take their dignity, but you cannot cage the mind, unless the person allows it. Then, one day, something happened that changed everything. I arrived at the square to find more people gathered around the cage than I had ever seen. Their voices were loud, some angry, some mocking. I pushed through, my heart hammering, and saw the cause. A man from the town council was standing near the cage, speaking in a voice meant to carry over the crowd. "He is dangerous," the man said. "He has lived outside our laws, outside our society. He cannot be trusted. He cannot be allowed to remain." I froze. I had known that many people resented him, feared him even, but I had not expected the council to take action, not yet. Panic rose in me, but the man in the cage was calm. He looked at me, and his eyes, steady and unwavering, seemed to say, "Trust me." The councilman continued. "We will take him tonight. He will be moved to the old stone keep on the hill, where he can be better contained. The cage here is insufficient. His mind is dangerous, and his presence corrupts the youth." My stomach twisted. Corrupts the youth? That was laughable. If anything, he had taught me more than anyone else ever could. And yet, I knew that words like these, once spoken in public, had power. People began murmuring, nodding in agreement, or laughing, or clapping their hands in grim approval. I ran to him, my chest tight. "You can't, please. You can't take him." He smiled faintly. "I have been preparing for this," he said. "They may move my body, but they will not touch what I carry inside. Remember that, boy. Remember what I have taught you. And do not let fear silence you." That night, under the pale glow of the moon, I watched from a distance as men lifted the cage onto a cart. He was calm, his face unreadable, but he caught my gaze. I waved, though my hands shook. He nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight than words ever could. In the days that followed, the town seemed emptier. The square felt smaller, colder, as if the man in the cage had been a heartbeat of life that the people had never acknowledged until it was gone. And yet, even though he was no longer there, I felt him everywhere. In the whispers of the wind, in the rustle of leaves, in the quiet moments before dawn. I decided to follow the cart one evening, sneaking behind the shadows as it wound its way up the hill to the stone keep. The place was old, built of gray stone that seemed to drink the light. The gates were enormous, and the walls high, as though they were meant to keep something in forever. And in a small courtyard, they set the cage down. He looked around, calm as ever, and for a moment, I thought I saw him smile. "Why do they do this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the wind. "They fear me," he said. "And they fear you too, because you have seen me as I am. People fear knowledge. They fear the truth. But it does not matter. The truth is stronger than chains." I stayed hidden, listening as they left, locking the gates behind them. Night fell, and the keep grew silent. I wanted to rush in, to free him, but I knew that would be foolish. I had no power against the council, no plan, no weapon. What I did have, he reminded me, was understanding, patience, observation, knowledge. I began visiting the keep secretly, bringing food, notes, small comforts, anything I could manage. I listened to him speak to me through the bars of his cage, and each time, I felt him teaching me something new, something sharper. He spoke of patience and strategy, of reading people, of surviving without surrendering. And always, he spoke of hope. One evening, he told me about the time before the cage, the life he had lived when the world was kinder, or maybe just unaware of his uniqueness. He spoke of forests that whispered secrets, of rivers that sang, of nights when the stars felt close enough to touch. And then he spoke of betrayal, of people who had turned on him, of families who had abandoned him, of neighbors who had reported him simply for existing differently. It is strange, he said quietly, how quickly people can become enemies when you do not fit their expectations. How easily kindness can turn into cruelty. And yet, I survived. Not because of strength, not because of luck, but because I never allowed their hatred to define me. I realized then that this was the lesson he had been preparing me for all along. The world would be cruel, yes, but I could choose how I responded. I could choose to learn, to observe, to act with courage, even when the odds were against me. And so, I kept coming, even as the nights grew longer and colder, even as the keep became more forbidding. I had become his witness, his companion in shadow, and slowly, I understood that the story of a man in a cage is never just about the bars. It is about the mind that refuses to bend, the spirit that refuses to break, and the lessons left for those who are willing to see. Winter arrived slowly, like a gray shadow crawling across the hills. The streets grew slippery with frost, the air sharp enough to bite at exposed skin, and the nights stretched longer, darker, and quieter. I still visited him at the keep, though it was harder now. The snow made paths treacherous, and the guards were more alert, their eyes like hawks tracking the smallest movement. But I could not stop. Every visit felt like a lifeline, both for him and for me. Inside the keep, the cage seemed smaller, more oppressive. The stone walls pressed around it like a cold weight, and the silence of the courtyard was almost unbearable. I would arrive at dusk, just as the last orange light faded behind the hills, and slip food through the bars. He never complained, never begged, never faltered. Sometimes he would sit silently, watching the sky change from gray to black, and I would sit beside him, feeling the chill bite through my coat. "Do they plan to keep you here forever?" I asked one evening, trying not to shiver. "They hope to," he said. But hope and reality are different things. I do not measure my life in walls or guards or gates. I measure it in what I learn, what I understand, and the truths I can carry with me, even if my body is trapped. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he said. There was a power in understanding, in seeing the world clearly, that the guards and the councilmen could never touch. And yet, I could not ignore the fear twisting in my stomach. What if they grew impatient? What if they decided that the cage, or even the keep, was not enough? The keep was old, ancient even, with corridors that smelled of damp stone and decay. The guards were cruel, not outwardly violent, but the kind of cruelty that gnaws at the mind. They spoke to him with disdain, mockery, and quiet threats. I sometimes overheard them, pacing in the shadows as they spoke of how the council had decreed he must not leave, that his cage was both a punishment and a warning to others. One night, I noticed a guard sneaking closer to him, carrying a length of chain that had once been used to bind prisoners who were far less remarkable. I felt a surge of panic and stepped closer, my hands trembling. But before I could act, the man in the cage spoke, calm as ever. "Step back, boy," he said. "Do not let their fear become yours. Chains are nothing if your mind does not bend." The guard cursed under his breath and left, and I realized that he had learned something I had not yet understood fully. Strength is not only in resistance. Sometimes it is in patience, in knowing when to fight and when to wait. And in that waiting, he was teaching me the hardest lesson of all: survival is not just about action, but about control of yourself, your fear, and your thoughts. Winter deepened. Snow blanketed the hills, covering the town and the surrounding forests in silence. It made traveling to the keep difficult, dangerous, and I often arrived late, exhausted and frozen, but still determined. I began to notice subtle changes in him too. He seemed smaller in the cold, his movements slower, his breathing heavier. And yet, his eyes retained that unshakable clarity, that same fire I had seen months before. I began to understand that the cage and the cold were slowly wearing him down, that even a spirit as strong as his could be tested to its limits. One evening, he spoke of a time long before he was caged, of a life where he had walked freely through forests, hunted by no one, feared by no one, and yet watched the world carefully. He told me of nights when the moon lit paths like silver rivers, and days when the sun warmed the skin with gentle hands. And then he spoke of betrayal, how people he trusted had turned against him, how whispers and rumors had turned townsfolk against him, and how even family could betray when fear outweighed love. Fear is contagious, he said quietly, eyes distant. And when it spreads, it changes the hearts of people who were once kind. I learned that long ago, and now I see it here. People fear what they cannot understand, and so they become cruel. It is not their fault entirely, fear drives them, and fear is a powerful master. I listened, shivering from the cold and the weight of his words. I realized that his suffering had taught him something the rest of the town could never learn, that cruelty is rarely born from malice alone. It grows from misunderstanding, from fear, and from the desire to control what cannot be controlled. And this truth, he said, was something I could carry forward, something that no cage could ever take from him. As the nights grew longer, I began noticing other things too. Guards would whisper about him, sometimes muttering that he was strange, that he had eyes that seemed to see through people, that his presence was unsettling. Some guards began leaving food untouched, or speaking less harshly, as if the quiet power of his mind had begun to reach them. And I began to understand that influence does not always need freedom to spread. Sometimes, it spreads quietly, through patience, observation, and the example of integrity. One bitter night, the cold heavier than I had ever felt, I sat beside the cage and whispered, "Do you ever think about leaving?" He looked at me, eyes dark and steady. "Leaving?" he asked. "I am here, boy. My body is here. But my mind, my stories, my knowledge, those travel further than any path, beyond walls, beyond snow, beyond fear. I have already left, in ways that matter more than any physical journey." I nodded slowly, realizing that he was teaching me more than survival. He was teaching me resilience. He was teaching me how to be free, even when trapped. How to endure cruelty without letting it break you. How to take the small actions that matter, even when they seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And most of all, he was teaching me how to see the world as it truly is, not as people claim it should be. But danger grew. Rumors of escape plans and whispers of rebellion began circulating among the guards. Some suspected that I was helping him, and their glances, sharp and suspicious, made me feel the weight of risk for the first time. Every visit became more dangerous. Every action, no matter how small, carried the possibility of punishment or discovery. Yet I returned, because the lessons he taught me were worth the risk. Each time I saw him, I understood more deeply the cost of freedom and the value of knowledge. And I realized that his story was not just his own, it had become mine, too, intertwined in ways I could not yet fully grasp. As the snow fell heavier, covering the keep in a blanket of silence, I sat beside him one last time that evening, listening to him speak of hope, patience, and endurance. I did not know what the coming months would bring, or whether the world would grow even harsher. But I knew one thing: no matter the cage, no matter the cold, no matter the cruelty of others, he had already left an imprint on my life. And through me, his story would continue, growing, spreading, teaching, long after the iron bars had claimed him. By the time the new year arrived, the cold had become almost unbearable. Snow drifted in waves across the hills, blanketing the town and the keep alike, and the wind carried a biting sting that made my fingers numb even through thick gloves. Yet, despite the winter's cruelty, I could not stop visiting him. Each night, I crept through the shadows, following hidden paths I had memorized, carrying what little food or warmth I could spare. I had become more cautious, quieter, and faster. Every guard's movement, every shadow, every creak of the keep's wooden floors felt like a warning. The man in the cage greeted me with the same calm as always, though I noticed the weight of months behind his eyes. He no longer leaned against the bars idly; instead, he seemed to measure every movement, every gesture. Yet when I handed him the bread and water, he smiled faintly, a reminder that even the smallest comforts mattered. That night, I asked him something I had been fearing for weeks. "Do you ever think they will leave you here forever? Do you think they will break you?" He laughed softly, a sound that seemed almost impossible in the freezing courtyard. "Break me," he repeated, shaking his head. "No, boy. They can lock my body, but not my mind. They can darken the sky and bind my arms, but they cannot take the fire that burns inside me. Chains only work if the soul allows them to. And I have never allowed that." I wanted to believe him, but the creeping fear in my chest was hard to ignore. The council was growing restless, rumors of escape or rebellion stirring unease in the guards. Some whispered of removing the cage entirely and placing him in a dungeon deeper than the keep itself. I realized that each passing day brought greater danger, not just to him, but to me as well. Then, one evening, I saw something that changed everything. I had arrived late, snow thick on the ground, and caught sight of a guard leaning too close to the cage, his shadow long and menacing in the lantern light. Before I could react, the man in the cage moved. He did not shout, he did not struggle violently. He simply shifted, calmly, deliberately, and the guard stumbled back, eyes wide, as if the very presence of the man had warned him. I gasped. How did you?" He smiled faintly, eyes calm and clear. "Patience, boy. Timing. Understanding who you are dealing with. Never underestimate the weight of calmness. It is often heavier than anger, and it carries far more power." That night, he spoke of things he had never told me before. Things that had shaped him long before the cage. He told me of a village where he had grown up, a place surrounded by forests so dense that the sun barely touched the ground. He spoke of people who had been kind, of friends he had laughed with, and of nights when he had watched the stars until sleep claimed him. And then he spoke of betrayal, the kind that leaves scars deeper than any wound, the kind that twists trust into fear. "People fear what they do not understand," he said quietly. "And when fear takes root, it spreads like wildfire. One person turns, another follows, and soon enough, even the kindest heart is hardened." I was different, and that difference made them afraid. Fear became my enemy long before any chain ever did. I shivered. He had taught me so much already, but hearing the story of betrayal, the depth of loneliness he had endured, made me realize just how much strength he had carried for years. Not strength of muscle, but of mind, heart, and spirit. As winter deepened, I began noticing subtle changes in the guards. Some lingered longer than necessary, watching him with suspicion. Others whispered in corners, casting uneasy glances toward the cage. It was as if they could sense, even without understanding, that he was no ordinary man. And I realized then that influence does not always need freedom. His presence alone was enough to unsettle, to make people question, even when their chains seemed absolute. Then came the night that changed everything. I had brought extra food, anticipating the long cold hours, and arrived just as a storm began to rage. Snow whipped against the keep, wind shrieking through the stone corridors. The lanterns flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts along the walls. I hurried to the cage, heart pounding, and found him sitting calmly, his eyes half closed, as if listening to the storm. "They will try something tonight," he said without looking at me. "They grow impatient. Fear breeds recklessness. And tonight, they will test the limits of my confinement." I froze. "What can I do?" I whispered. "Watch. Learn. Be ready," he said. Sometimes, survival is not about action, but about knowing when to act. And sometimes, being ready is enough. Hours passed. The storm raged. I watched from a shadowed corner as figures approached the cage, carrying tools meant to tighten chains and secure the door. The men hesitated, glancing at each other nervously. And then, without warning, the man in the cage moved with a speed I had never seen. Not violent, not reckless, but precise and deliberate. He shifted, leaned, and the tools clattered to the ground as the men stumbled back, startled by a presence they could not fully understand. I gasped, heart hammering. He turned toward me, eyes calm, almost gentle. "Do you see, boy? Chains cannot hold what refuses to be bound. Knowledge, patience, understanding, these are stronger than iron. And courage, yes, courage is the final key." The guards retreated, muttering, fearful of something they could not name. I realized that the man's strength was not just physical, it was the result of years of endurance, observation, and clarity of mind. He had survived because he understood the world, its people, and their fears better than anyone else. After the storm passed, I sat beside him, shivering, hands numb. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "They will not give up easily, boy. Cruelty, once tasted, craves continuation. But I have time, and I have patience. And you," he looked at me, eyes steady. "You will carry this forward. Remember everything. Understand everything. Do not let fear guide you." I nodded, understanding that this was more than a lesson in survival. It was a lesson in life itself. That even when the world grows cruel, even when chains and walls seem absolute, there is a way to endure, to remain unbroken, and to influence the world without violence. I left that night, trudging through snow and wind, my mind racing. I understood something crucial: the man in the cage was no longer just a prisoner of iron and stone. He was a teacher, a guardian of knowledge and courage, and I was the one who had to witness, remember, and carry his lessons forward. And I knew, deep in my heart, that the coming months would test both of us in ways I could not yet imagine. But I was ready, or at least, I hoped I was. Because some lessons, the most important ones, demand more than courage. They demand endurance, observation, and the quiet strength to act when the time is right. By midwinter, the cold had become almost unbearable. Snow lay thick on the keep's roofs and drifts piled along the stone walls, making the journey to his cage feel longer, more dangerous, every time I came. The wind cut through my coat and gloves, but still, I went. I could not stop. There was something urgent in the way the man in the cage spoke now, a quiet intensity that made me feel as if every word was a spark I had to catch and carry with me. That evening, I slipped through the shadows as usual, my boots crunching softly on the icy ground. The keep was dark and silent, except for the occasional scrape of a guard's boot on stone. When I reached the courtyard, I saw him waiting, eyes fixed on the sky, as if the storm had passed but the air still carried warnings. "They watch more closely now," he said without looking at me. "The council fears my influence, even in silence. And you, they will notice you soon if you are not careful." "I am careful," I said quickly, though I knew it was not enough. My heart raced every time a guard moved too close, every time shadows shifted in the corners of the courtyard. "Careful is not enough," he said softly. "You must understand. They cannot touch your mind. That is the one thing no cage can hold. Your courage, your observation, your thoughts, they are free. You must keep them so." I listened, nodding, trying to absorb everything he said. There was a gravity in his voice now, a sense that time was running out, or at least that something was about to change. The nights grew longer, and the tension in the keep was palpable. Guards whispered among themselves, voices low and wary, as if fearing the man in the cage might hear what they said and see through their deception. I began noticing subtle changes in the man himself. He moved less, conserving energy, but his eyes were sharper than ever, scanning the courtyard, the walls, and even the heavens as if measuring the smallest details. One night, I arrived to find him holding a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to me without a word. I unfolded it carefully, my hands trembling from the cold and anticipation. On it was a simple diagram, marking paths, doors, and guard positions. "They think the keep is secure," he said quietly. "They believe walls and snow and their own fear are enough. They are wrong. Observe, learn, and prepare. Patience will win where force fails." My stomach twisted. I had never imagined taking such responsibility. I was just a boy, yet now I was entrusted with knowledge that could change everything. I realized that he had been teaching me not just survival, but strategy, foresight, and courage. And I also realized that the danger had grown. If a guard discovered this paper or my involvement, the consequences would be severe. Over the following days, I observed. I memorized guard routines, noting their shifts, their weaknesses, the moments when they relaxed just enough to make mistakes. I followed every instruction he gave, careful not to alert anyone to my movements. I felt the weight of every decision, knowing that even a small misstep could bring disaster. During one visit, he spoke of the power of observation. "The eyes are more important than the hands," he said. "To watch is to know, and to know is to survive. They may control the doors and the bars, but they cannot control what you see and understand. Remember that. Watch everything, and you will see opportunities others cannot imagine." I nodded, trying to remember every word. He had begun speaking in lessons now, deliberately, as if preparing me for something I could not yet understand. The snowstorm outside howled, but inside the cage, his presence was a quiet fire, steady and unyielding. Then, one night, I saw a guard slip from the shadows, lantern in hand, moving toward the cage with a look that made my blood run cold. He had discovered something, perhaps the diagram, perhaps my visits, and his expression promised punishment. My heart pounded. I was frozen, but the man in the cage did not flinch. "Step aside," he whispered, almost imperceptibly. I obeyed, unsure what would happen next. The guard raised the lantern, but before he could speak, the man shifted slightly, moving in a way so subtle yet precise that the guard stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. The lantern wobbled, light flickering across the courtyard as the guard cursed and scrambled to regain control. I realized, with a shock, that the man had not even raised his voice. The calmness, the timing, the understanding of movement, all of it had been enough to protect both of us. After the guard left, muttering under his breath, the man turned to me. "Do you see now?" he asked. "Strength is not in violence. Strength is in patience, in knowledge, in understanding the mind of your opponent. Never forget this lesson. One day, you may need it more than you imagine." I nodded, shivering, not just from the cold but from the weight of what I had witnessed. He was teaching me survival, yes, but also something much deeper: how to live, how to act, and how to endure even when the world seemed determined to destroy you. The following days were tense. I visited as usual, bringing small comforts, but I felt the shadow of discovery looming over us both. Yet, each time I arrived, he greeted me calmly, with the quiet certainty of someone who had endured far worse. He began to speak more about the importance of hope, of vision, of using the mind to navigate a world that often rewards cruelty over compassion. "You must carry this forward," he said one evening, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The lessons I leave are not just for survival, but for life. One day, you will face choices that demand courage, patience, and clarity. Remember what you have seen here. Carry it with you. Even when fear surrounds you, even when walls close in, even when the world seems cruel, you will have what they cannot take: your mind, your understanding, and your resolve." I realized then that I was no longer just a boy visiting a prisoner. I was his witness, his student, and perhaps the only one who could continue the story he had built from years of suffering, endurance, and understanding. Winter pressed on, harsh and unyielding, but I carried his lessons in my heart. Every step I took in the snow, every cautious movement through the keep, every whisper in the cold night air was a reminder that knowledge, patience, and courage could bend even the harshest circumstances. And I began to understand that the story of a man in a cage is never just about confinement. It is about the mind that refuses to be caged, the courage that endures beyond the body, and the lessons that survive even when the world seems determined to erase them.